Welcome to week 5, analyzing and evaluating reports of quantitative research. This is where we really get into the bulk of this course. This is probably the next several chapters will be relating to quantitative research. There is sections that we will cover on qualitative research, as we've already introduced both of those terms and how they differ in terms of the way we approach the research and the way we report it and the way we're able to generalize. But in education, and especially public education, you are almost always looking at quantitative research and quantitative studies. Those are the kinds of numbers that legislators and folks who make those kinds of decisions, stakeholders and administrators, they want to see those kinds of things that they think are really generalizable. And when we get into experimental designs, that's the preferred or the gold standard of research. But there's a lot of different ways to approach a research question and get some sense or some answers to support a thesis that you might have. So this week is really all about looking at quantitative research, and the objectives are to identify research constructs, measures, variables, and sampling procedures that are used in a study. And those are terms that are introduced in your text. There are also things I'm going to ask you on the quiz, and there are also things that you're going to need to know and understand for the discussion. The second objective is to develop skills to critically evaluate the quality of a research study. So I'm going to give you a couple of topics this week. You're going to take a look at some research that may or may not support that particular topic in education or educational practice, and determine, based on the study that you read, critically evaluating it for the essential components of a high-quality quantitative study, whether or not you think the findings are valid. And the third one is to discuss the implications of research findings to practice. In other words, okay, now we know about this. Is this enough for me to change what I'm doing, or do I need more research to support that particular instance or that particular finding in this particular audience with this sample? So those are the three objectives, and quite honestly, they could almost be the objectives for the course. This is reading and applying research. You're going to have to know just enough statistics to determine whether when you read an article, it's really telling you something, or whether you're being sold something as almost a sales pitch with some artificial type, maybe bloated language. And so we're going to look at a couple of topics that came to me in my email. Also, if you subscribe to ASCD, you probably saw these as well. And we're going to decide if we think that those are really supported by research or not. So it is Chapter 5. We're going to take a look at Appendix 3 in your text. That's actually what you're going to use to help you with the study. My video will go here shortly. You might also notice that there are several other supportive videos this week. As we get into this quantitative area, I realize that some of you have had a statistics course, and some of you have had a research methods course. That's going to serve you well. Things are going to be a little easier for you because you should already be very familiar with the vocabulary. But sometimes it's good to read it, think about it, and then in this case, watch a movie and have some other illustrations or examples presented to you beyond what you read in your text, beyond what I talk about here very briefly. With some of these other types of videos. And believe me, there are a lot of videos on this topic on YouTube, Vimeo, and other places. I have gone through them over a great deal of time to pull the ones that I thought were short enough, sweet enough, but got to the point and were very good examples for education. Some of them are talking about in psychology, but keep in mind that education and psychology are closely linked because we're talking about cognitive processes, and the cognitive process we're talking about is learning. So sometimes when they use the word psychology, you can almost substitute the word education because there's such a great deal of overlap. So I would recommend, when you see multiple videos like this, and you will see these for the next several weeks because there are so many terms introduced, and I don't want to make a 45-minute or two 45-minute lectures on this when other folks have made good snippets, and it's nice to have that variety in a course, and with my reflections, that's even more Spielmaker. So hopefully this will help add clarity to what you're reading. So intro to statistics, tests, and measurement, sampling method, reliability and validity, understanding measurement validity, improving measurement reliability, and standard error of measurement. These are the videos that I've put out this week, and like I said, there'll be some more on each of the following weeks, especially as we go through this quantitative sections. Do note that I typically put them in an order that I want you to watch them, or what I would say is the best way to watch them. It's usually the way that the content was presented in your text, so it kind of keeps things a little more organized. So I would start here after my video. Hopefully you're watching it first. then go to Intro to Statistics, down this left side for reliability and validity, then back up here and down the other side. And that, if you watch them out of order, it's not a big deal, but it'll be more clear, especially if you watch sampling methods before you watch standard error measurement. Otherwise, you're like, wait a minute, standard error measurement, I didn't really follow what sampling or populations were. So I would definitely recommend watching them in this order. This week, you have the discussions, and I haven't put it here yet, but there'll be a quiz primarily on the terminology. And that's what I want to take a look at then and highlight a few things in your text. This is chapter 5, and I'm looking at it here. Its overview is right here on the left side where the table of contents pops up. You're looking at first the organization of a research report, then talks about what an abstract and an introduction are, and I'm pretty convinced that you'll know what those are by now. You've seen this, you've assigned these yourselves, you have enough experience with your undergraduate to maybe understand what the abstract and introduction is, and this is in the area where they talk about what the constructs and the variables are, what constants are related to variables, again a review, and we will continue to talk about hypotheses, questions, and objectives, and then a literature review. Oftentimes, those of you who are doing a thesis, you will have an abstract, an introduction, and then your literature review. In fact, literature review is going to be chapter 2. Chapter 1 is going to be the introduction. Your abstract stands alone, as well as your table of contents. So this chapter is organized much like you would see a thesis or any research paper. A literature review and a thesis is going to be much more extensive than something you're going to see in an article, which is what your chapter talks about. So that's like the first section. And I think if you kind of have this overview when you go into reading, it's going to make a little bit more sense to you as to what the chapter is telling you. The next section is on sampling procedures, and sampling is, it can make a study invalid real quick. If the sampling procedures weren't followed or the sampling is invalid and they're making big sweeping generalizations to a larger population, this is where you have problems. And so here they'll talk about the researcher's qualifications, sampling, volunteer samples, and validity. And under these qualifications, it's not necessarily talking about why they're disqualified, but what they are using in terms of qualifications to support their study. So that might be a little different than you think until you start reading it. This third section here, I guess it's fourth section, is on the different measures. And oops, I probably should just pull this open. This is talking about the different types of measures, the validity measures, reliability measures, all the things that I've added some additional videos for you on. Limitations of test validity, sources of information. Some of this should be review for you. Developing a measure. This is the part that's probably the most critical piece of the chapter. And it's because in addition to making sure you have the right sample size, if you don't have an instrument that measures what you want it to measure, it's completely invalid. And I'll go back onto my own dissertation topic. If I could go back in time, this is where I would have spent more time. I had experts help me in what's called a Delphi type of review to develop the measurement, to develop the instrument. And quite honestly, I wish we would have used an instrument that was created on some different scales that had longer term validity related to career education than the one that we created. It just could have been a lot better. And that will introduce then some flaws or limitations to your study. The methods section is talking about research designs, and this is a very brief section, but research designs are now, after this chapter, talked about chapter by chapter. So there's additional detail on those. I might also add that there are entire courses on each one of those research design types at universities. The results section, what's included there is discussed, and also what comes on in place in a discussion section, which I might add is usually the most difficult thing to write when you're writing any kind of paper. And you see the results, and now it's time to interpret them and discuss them. And you're hoping that your interpretation is not biased, that it's going through as many not necessarily filters, but through as much what you know about research to support what you're saying, so that you're not making claims that are outside of what the results show. The discussion section, quite honestly, can take a lot of time. The two biggest parts of a paper are, and especially a thesis, are the lit review and the discussion. The results are actually really easy. You just explain what was the result. But the discussion is much more detailed, and here they just talk about it a little bit, you know, basically half a page. But that is really the difficult part. It's the interpretation of the results. And sometimes people get it wrong. And some of the topics that we're going to be looking at this week, you're going to determine, did they get it wrong, or is what they are saying that's good for us as educators, what's good for us in terms of student achievement, is it really supported by the results that they have, where they interpreted correctly so that they have meaningful transitions into the classroom. So that's the kind of an overview of this chapter, and it is kind of a big overview to the rest of the text, at least until we get to the qualitative sections. So let's go back then to the first section, page right at the beginning of chapter 5. Highlighted a few things here. Let's get rid of this. Make this a little bit bigger. They always start, as you know, with the problems of practice to try and get you interested in the content. So I've highlighted ones that I thought were really interesting here. It talks about unmotivated learners. I've had a lot of teachers come to me over the years and say, what do you do for a student that just has their head down the whole time and just is not there to learn at all? And I know that right now all of you are thinking of those types of students. And so there's research on that particular topic that you might choose to look at to say, what can I do for unmotivated students? Other problems of practice about how to find information about tests and other measures that we might want to use that already have validity and reliability. And what can be done to increase the currently small percentage of women who take courses and pursue careers in STEM. And actually, that's a big topic, especially in CTE. They could have added a whole bunch. In fact, I feel like in this part, they could have added all of the problems of practice in all of the 4 previous chapters under this topic. The important ideas here, and there are numerous important ideas, maybe 20, but I've highlighted a couple things. Make sure you know what a construct is and how those things get selected and put together, how that phenomena adds up. And for here, because you will judge the quality of a study by how well the hypotheses were tested, the research questions were answered, or the research objectives were achieved, you need to be looking at that explicitly in terms of the design. Did they do it correctly? Did they have the right population? And so on and so forth. So that's another one of those important ideas. They also note that space limitations in journals sometimes don't allow you to have all the relevant studies in there, but certainly the most relevant ones should be in there, and the ones that are probably the most recent or the pivotal kinds of research. And so that's one thing they talk about when you're looking at the reference section of a study. The authors talk about what's in a report. They're very much want to make sure that inside of there you have somebody talking about what the sample or the target population is. Obviously, if that's not in there, you can't possibly generalize anywhere beyond what it may just be talking about for a particular population there. If they didn't say how they drew their sample, or if in fact it wasn't a sample, it was a case study, that kind of thing's got to be in there. I skipped past here a little bit. Random sampling is the gold standard. It's discussed briefly. It comes back again in, I think it's chapter 9 on experimental designs. Even though I don't have these highlighted, it doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that some of these are like, they really stick out to me. Again, talking about how generalizable the results are, how big was the sample, did it represent them demographically. They spend some time on this in this chapter, but it will come back and they'll continue to talk about it in another couple chapters, and that's good because it is such an important concept when you're designing research. What else we have here? Should specify the variables that they're measuring if they're putting it into a scale, and it talks about a questionnaire and an interview and all those different ways to observe and get results. Talks about the development of a questionnaire, and again, that instrumentation, a survey, a test, that instrument that we use to create a measure is between that and the sample and the research design. I'd say those 3 things: design that you chose, the sample that you were able to use and it being representative depending on how you want to generalize it, and the instrumentation. If you have that real solid with your particular topic, then you're probably going to have good, valid results. Skipping down here to 13, whether the observers were adequately trained. That's if you're doing observations. You can't just say here, and they give an example of teachers all grading the same essay. Even with a rubric, their scores are vastly different. So there needs to be some training that goes on there, and you need to test to make sure that everybody eventually gets to similar marks so that there's similar interpretation of what's being observed. What else? A test describes the research report as valid to the extent of the interpretations by those scores. And that's why you need to know just a little bit about statistics. Because if you don't understand how something was computed, not saying you have to be able to compute it, but how it was computed, it sometimes may be difficult for you to decide, hey, is that being interpreted accurately? Is that something that I should really think about and put into my life and so forth in my classroom? The 16 here, the test described in a research report is reliable and to the extent that it's free of measurement error. Now, measurement error is discussed in your text. It's also a small video that I have, and it will come back again a couple times because it's a really important statistical concept to understand that when we're taking a measurement, first we have the tool itself that may not measure what we want, but then there's measurement error after we even create a valid instrument. So make sure you know the difference there. And I believe that that is discussed here in the key terms, and I've highlighted a few. When I highlight these are really important terms that I think are perhaps new to you. But there may be others that you're like, I've never heard that word. I can't even infer what that word might be by the words that are here. But constant construct, content analysis, Cronbach's alpha, face validity, hypothesis, again, inter-rater reliability, that's making sure that all of your observers are marking things the same. A Likert type scale, which you have probably been scoring on for the last 20 or 30 years of your life, even at, maybe even as low as in 3rd grade. Measurement error. Remember I talked about measurement error, and we talked about standard error of measurement. They are two different things. Make sure that you know the differences between those two. One's about the actual measure that you're using, and then the one is the actual error of the measurement that you make. What else? Population validity, quantitative research, difference between a questionnaire and what it might be as it relates to a test. Sometimes it's just semantics that we're talking about here, but there is a difference. Reliability coefficient, which is something that you should calculate, and I'll probably discuss this in my reflection, but something that should be calculated on all of the, when you develop an instrument to make sure that it is reliable. There's a coefficient there that says, yes, I can give this with some confidence. If you have a low one, I think the one that I had on CTE was only a 0.70. You really want a 0.80 as they discuss. You got to say, I'm not sure that this is a real stable or reliable instrument. So make sure that you understand what reliability means. And there are a couple of videos on that as well. I've already talked about sampling, scales, how you're going to scale up a particular item. It could tie into the way that you measure a construct. And then variable and volunteer samples, again, it goes back to sampling. These are all just in alphabetical order. So that's a little overview of the important concepts, why you would need it, and some of the words are part of the vocabulary, key terms, and they're bolded in your text. So that's nice that you can find them pretty easily. Your quiz is open notes, so make sure you don't just read what the definition is, but you really understand it, so when you see those distractors on the quiz, you can really try and figure out which one is the most accurate based on the type of explanation that they gave. And by the way, you can open Google if you don't feel like you really understand it, and Google that term and see if you can get some more understanding about it, because I'm not concerned that at that moment you get it right or wrong. I'm concerned that at that moment you say, I'm not really sure what that word means, and you spend time to look it up to hopefully learn that term because it will become part of your vocabulary in this course moving forward.